pulpit. The reason I am is because I'm putting on kind of my professor hat this next week. We're having this is our second day for the Our Lady of Mount Carmel Novena. And we're working through the work by Saint Bonaventure, A Soul's Journey into God. Yesterday I gave you the introduction to the text. I gave you an introduction to Saint Bonaventure. I explained some basic theology of Bonaventure and what his goal and aim are in this text. And I talked to you all about the steps that would be necessary in making our kind of ladder of divine ascent to God in regards to what we are going to be contemplating the next few days. The first step that we mentioned that we would be discovering was step one, how to contemplate God in the cosmos, in the creation. And that's what we'll be discussing today. So please forgive me if you're used to more sermonic material. This is probably going to be a bit dense. But don't worry, next Sunday the density will be finalized. Okay? Then after that, we'll go back tomorrow. But, well, I really enjoyed kind of getting into the depths of the theological text. So this will be at least fun for me. St. Bonaventure points out that no one can be happy unless he rise above himself. Not by an ascent of the body, but by the ascent of the heart. He says that we cannot rise above ourselves unless a higher power lifts us up. You've heard it before, right? Picking yourself up by your own bootstraps, right? The impossibility of the idea. It necessitates that if we desire to be with God, we need His assistance. We need divine aid. And he says this divine aid is only accessible by prayer. And he calls prayer the mother of the ascent. It's the mother of the ascent, meaning it's the thing most necessary if we desire to ascend with God. Now, what he points out is that in relationship to our position in creation, the universe itself is a ladder by which we ascend to God, by our relationship to creation. So, in the creation, you have the spiritual beings, the angels, right? And then you have human beings, which have a spiritual nature, but we also have a physical nature, right? And then you have all the other physical things on earth, which don't have a spiritual nature, but which have a physical nature only. Humans then are a particular relationship to creation. Okay? We're a unique relationship. None of the animals have a relationship to creation that we have. None of the angels have a relationship to creation that we have. We are very unique in that way. And so he wants to talk about that. How, in your position as a human being, how do you ascend to God? And so he goes through and he talks about different, what he calls vestiges of creation. I pointed out last night what a vestige was. Does anyone remember what a vestige is, literally in interpretation? The literal meaning of vestige? A footprint. Yeah. That's right. So all of creation for Bonaventure is a footprint of God. Okay? It shows that he's been there before. If you've taken kind of natural science, you've heard about footprints, how we shouldn't leave our footprints everywhere as humans, right? In other words, we shouldn't destroy the world. But God doesn't destroy the world by making His footprint. He leaves us a sign and symbol of His presence. And it's our job to read the signs and the symbols accurately. And these are referred to by Bonaventure as footprints or vestiges. And so some of these created things are vestiges, some of them are images, some of them are materials, some spiritual, some temporal, some everlasting, some outside of us, some within us. But nevertheless, these vestiges or footprints are everywhere. The question is, are we able to pay attention to them and accurately read them as signs pointing to God? And that's what he wants to help us do. So he refers to God as the first principle. The rest of these principles are kind of smaller principles, smaller ideas that lead us back to the original idea. Okay? That only is in God, it's an eternal idea because it's God himself. So he is the eternal idea in this way. He says in order to contemplate this first principle, God, we must first climb a ladder of creation. It leads us to him, who is the principle, because it's through him that all of creation is emulated. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that, think about this, out of the mind of God, everything that's in creation came into existence. Okay? Now, if it came from the mind of God, in the sense that God thought of this creation, he spoke into being, then everything that comes out must be in some way a reflection of God. So the world is a kind of mirror. And it's somewhat broken to us, is what Bonaventure would say. Somewhat broken to us because of original sin, which implies two things: the weakness of the mind. So the weakness of the mind means our inability to grasp God and understanding, and also the concupiscence of the will. That means our will's desire to do bad things. Okay? And those two things keep us from properly being oriented towards perceiving God in the footprints that he's left behind for us. Well, that's what gets in the way. What goes for us is prayer and contemplation. And the first thing that he says we should contemplate then is let's contemplate the world, because that's the lowest level of the created order. So we want to start from the bottom and move our way up to eventually contemplating the Trinity. That will be for the sixth day. The sixth day, no, actually it'll be the seventh day of our meeting. Okay? Now, in the human person, we have basically three ways in which we can contemplate God. We have what's external to us, the empirical order, okay, the physical stuff around us. We have that which is internal to us, right, our mind. What's going on inside, our soul, our spirit. And then we have what's above us, God. So we begin with the lowest order, once again. What's external to us? So far, so good? Makes sense? Okay? So, now then, in addition to living a holy life in prayer, he tells us that we must do three things if we want to understand the order around us. We must investigate with reason. We must believe faithfully. And we must contemplate intellectually. These three ways of considering the material order will lead us to understanding certain attributes of God. Now, I'm the one who put attributes there. He didn't say that, but it is attributes. Why? Because there's a distinction between characteristics and attributes. A characteristic in God is who God is in himself. God is love. That's a characteristic. It's who God is in himself. An attribute is the way that we basically encounter God. Okay? It's the way that we perceive God's relationship to us. That's the easiest way I can describe it. So when we're investigating the created order, I think it's most proper to talk about attributes of God. Because what we're talking about is how do we encounter God? How do we encounter God? Not necessarily himself, but in other things around us. Make sense? So, we want to use these three means of inquiring about the world in order to understand certain attributes of who God is. So, how do we do that? Well, let's first go through each one of those ways, and I'll show you how it's done. Okay? First, we investigate by reason. In other words, we see some things merely exist. Some exist and live. Others exist, live, and discern. We see a difference as we begin to investigate the world around us. We see these differences. Some things exist merely, some things exist and live, rocks versus dogs, and some exist, live, and discern, human beings. Dogs don't discern. Dogs don't contemplate life, right? This is the difference. We observe that there's a distinction in orders. Now, once we begin to discern that there are these distinctions in orders, we begin to ask questions. Okay, kids do this. The kid is my foil for this whole thing. I'm just sure that even kids understand what Bonaventure is saying. Okay? First of all, kids know right off the bat that we are not like the animals. And they know that they're above animals. Don't they? Kids get it. Kids do. They go, oh, well, he's just a dog. They say that. Every kid knows that. That's just a cat. That's just a rock. Right? Kid has no problem kicking a rock down the street. Right? Has a little bit more hesitation on kicking the dog. A lot more hesitation on kicking mom. we naturally, or brother or sister, even, there's more hesitation there. Why? Because even kids understand there's a distinction in order. There's a distinction in the order that is around us. Because little kids are discerners. Because little kids are human beings. They naturally tend towards discerning these distinctions. When kids are discerning this, they're also discerning something called perfection. They understand that some things are more perfect, and some things are less perfect, and some things are most imperfect. If I bring a spoon to a child that's bent over backwards, they automatically know that is an imperfect spoon. Because they're discerners. You give that spoon to the dog, nothing. Why is that? Because there's something intrinsic in our nature that can discern less perfect to more perfect. We can discern greater and lesser. We understand that there's a hierarchy in creation. There are some things that are more important, there are some things that are less important, and we understand that by nature. Because by nature you are a discerner. You're able to think through and investigate reality. So, if kids can discern that there's a less perfect, then guess what they begin to understand in their mind? There is a most perfect. From an early age, children already begin to understand that there's a conception of God in the reality that they experience around them. There is a most perfect. There is, at the top of this food chain, a being that must have come first, that's higher in order than the rest. And so because of this, investigation of reason, just considering the reality that's around us, we begin to think there's something that's purely spiritual, that's at the top of the food chain. There's something that doesn't change. There must be something that came before. Why? Look at it. My 4-year-olds have asked me, almost all of them at some point, who created God? They get it. They get it. For every effect, there must be a cause. They don't have to know that rule. They experience that rule. And they know it's true. And that's when we get to tell them the amazing reality. There must be an uncaused causer. There must be someone who is not caused at all. That's the only logical explanation. So, they begin to understand right from the start, this being must be uncaused. So by their investigative reality, we can learn that God is powerful. He brought all of it into existence. He is wise. He ordered the different hierarchy. He is good. He is existing. He must be in order for us to be. He's living. He's purely spiritual. He's incorruptible and unchanging. These are basic truths that we can gather just by investigating reality. Of course, I haven't given you the proofs for all of those things. Okay? I've given you the general principles by how we can investigate reality to discern those things. And that's just the start. Other than investigation, Bonaventure points out that we must believe faithfully. When we believe faithfully, what we understand about creation is that we should consider its origin, its process, and its end. The origin of creation, the process of creation, creation and the end of creation. In its origin, we see God's power through faith. He is outside of cause. He simply spoke it, and it was. So we see in its origin, the power of this being must be incomprehensible. We also see in the process of creation the providence of God through faith. For example, the evolving of species, the terms of man's progression, his progression and understanding, even in God's revealing of himself. He first gave man creation, and then he gave him fall, and then he gave him grace. We see the order then of man's kind of spiritual evolution, if you will. By seeing that man develops an understanding and that animals themselves are provided for, as Jesus points out, we begin to appreciate the providence of God. That means God's care and concern mixed with his power, his ability to help us in his care and concern. And as we consider the process of God, since we've already considered that there are lower and higher things and beginnings and ends of things, we must consider the end. And when we consider the end by faith, then we understand the justice of God. Because we understand that all things must be put back into a good order, since life is basically about goodness. So through the eyes of faith, then, we're able to appreciate that in the end, there will be justice in God. And so, what he wants to point out is that we can understand God's providence, we can understand God's power, and we can understand God's justice when we are believing faithfully. Finally, Bonaventure points out that we must contemplate intellectually. And in this, what he means is we have to see things in themselves. We see in particular objects. We see weight, we see number, and we see measure, the size of things. When we contemplate that there are particularities in things that we consider weight and measure and number, we're able to see other attributes of God. So a child might marvel at how heavy a thing can be, right? Even adults do. The other day, I was in the living room, and I found this little kind of weighted piece of metal, and oh wow, this is very heavy. And I passed it around, and everyone in my room wanted to hold the thing, right? Yes, this is very heavy. We marvel, right? We marvel at great things. And there's a reason for that. The measurements seem to be different than the other measurements. And maybe we can think to ourselves something philosophical, like, is God so powerful that he could create a stone which he himself could not lift? Right? We begin to start to think about these greater ideas of measurements and weight and number. And kids love to talk about this. Well, I love you, or usually it's not I love. It's usually something like, I'm better than you 1,000,000 times. And the other one, I'm better than you 1,000,000,000,000 times. I'm better than you infinity. Right? And already the child begins to understand when it thinks about the particularities of reality, that there's something that's vast, that's innumerable. Right? Even in the early development of Greek philosophy, Parmenides formed an entire school trying to explain how reality is composed of numbers. He was wrong and got proven wrong very quickly. But nevertheless, the fact that he can even think about the world as this infinite thing, this numberless thing, that it somehow explained the reality that was around us, it shows that this is kind of part of who we are, to think about expansiveness. And what it does when we begin to think about expansiveness is we start to realize there's something beyond the measurement that my mind can possibly conceive. Right? And what does that do? That points, it's a vestige of God's eternality. It's a vestige to point us to there's something beyond this human comprehension. A child might notice the balance in the room is off. We tell our children, go pick up your room. And what do we mean? We mean the weight, the number, and the measurements are all wrong here. How do they instinctively get that? How do we get that? How do we look at a room say the weight, the measurement, and the number is all off here. How do we do that? You cannot tell a dog, go pick up the room. They have no idea. My dogs eat the bed that they lay on. They have no clue, but somehow a kid can get that. And why? Because God built into our minds reason, the ability to comprehend, to look at a reality and say, there's a certain way this thing has to be in order to create order. Right? And that order is once again a vestige of God's presence in our lives. A chaotic room. Did you know that one of the things that exorcists notice when they go to a demoniac's home is that it's incredibly messy? Incredibly messy. There's no order. There's no order. In fact, some of them even have glass shards on the floor, things that would hurt a person, right? That is, it doesn't matter who you are, if you're a Christian or not, you go into that room and you go, something's wrong, right? And you even kind of sense something's morally wrong, like recording or something, right? You go, something's wrong, something's morally off here. This isn't human. It's not human to do that, right? Well, what is that reaction? That reaction is the reason that exists within us. What is that reason that exists within us? With the divine logos, the Word of God. So we see, even by looking at order itself, that God is pointed to. God is primarily a being about order. He likes order. He keeps order. He doesn't like chaos. In fact, if you read the book of Genesis, what's the first thing that Yahweh overcomes? Chaos. The world was full of, it was formless and void. That word is actually chaos. There's chaos in the order. And God created order. Right? What's one of the first commandments that he gives us? Go fill the earth and subdue it. Order it. Order it, man. So, these principles, what they ultimately do is they lead us to our understanding of God and his attributes. So the creation itself points back to God. Right? One of my uncles used to say, that he never felt closer to God than he would when he was in nature. And I can affirm that, right? Nature is a place where we can encounter God. And that's a wonderful starting point. That's step one though. Okay? So it's amazing because all these principles are level one stuff. We're looking at level one. Right? And so what happens is once we understand these basic tenets or attributes of God, then we're able to kind of move forward. In conclusion, the first step on the ladder of ascending to God through prayer must begin from the bottom of God's splendor and the vestiges of the physical order. By investigating, trusting, and contemplating the creation, we come to learn that God is powerful, wise, good, existing, living, purely spiritual, incorruptible, unchangeable, providential, and just. Tomorrow we consider the second step, or wing, if you were with me the first night, and that is the five senses. So tomorrow we'll explore how taste, touch, smell, sight, etc. lead us to an understanding